Hope you don't mind if I smoke. Arthur took the cigarette from the pack in his pocket and removed it. Donovan didn't pay him any mind. Donovan didn't see any point to this pattern. He knew it was a pattern of some kind, but only patterns that mattered need to be recorded. That's been Donovan's rule ever since he returned. Returned from where? That's a good question. Donovan doesn't have an answer. He doesn't remember anything of the death. But there was one. He's aware of that. I wouldn't care if you did or didn't, Donovan said flatly. Arthur just stared at him. His partner was definitely something different now. Not a monster. Monster's the wrong word for it, but everything about him is different. The vibrance that he used to have, his joking demeanor. He was a regular cut-up in the beginning, the kind of guy you noticed at the office that would always be there with a joke, and usually on the dirty side. But no one really would mind. I have to talk to you, Donovan. Everything seems so different since you've... Arthur trailed off. He wasn't really sure how to finish that sentence. But Donovan chimed in, with timing that almost seemed immaculate. Since I returned from the other side, that's what you're meaning to say, isn't it? Arthur looked at him, but didn't really have any sort of solid response. He didn't want to even speak of what had happened to his partner. A few months ago, they were investigating a recent site. It was said to have paranormal activity, and as officers of the Paranormal Enforcement Division, PED, to you who do not inhabit the insane world that us New Yorkers do these days, it was a strange time. Ever since the gate had opened in 1996 and let all manner of things through, life had become very different. It wasn't just the normal street thugs and morons and pushers that were giving problems these days. It was insanity. Straight insanity. And Arthur wasn't really sure how to cope with it in the beginning. And Donovan seemed to be much in the same boat, but these days, Donovan was just almost robotic. Like a human being that had had everything scooped out, its personality, its likes, its dislikes, everything was gone. Tabula rasa, blank slate. And sometimes it scared him. In the 2 months preceding his death, Donovan was back to his normal self after dealing with a fair amount of trauma at the death of his wife. Shape changer. Doppelganger. There's many names for whatever took her, but they never found out exactly which one did it. And his partner suspected that it haunted him. But now, it's as if he never even had a wife. I can assure you that there's nothing wrong with me, Arthur. At least not in the physical sense. But if there is any other kind of change, He trailed off for a moment and then found himself. I couldn't give you any good description of what it is. Arthur had very little to say to that. He wasn't sure how to convey emotion to a person that seems like he wouldn't even be able to understand it if he tried. They had a word for this, the collective, the group of researchers at the PED that were trying to understand all these strange new things that were inhabiting our world. Nold new. Without a soul. The idea terrified Arthur. Someone without a soul could, well, do anything and feel no remorse. Snap a child's neck, take his partner's gun, and plant it in the base of his skull. and pull the trigger with no remorse. Aurthor had to push these thoughts out of his head on a regular basis. He couldn't think of his partner this way. He had to hope that the loyalties were still there. The loyalties that these two mortals shared in a world that was filled with the strange and the dangerous now. The paranormal. The paranormal that they are meant to police, enforce, and of course even protect, like even any mortal. The paranormal, the Othersiders, they had their rights too. That was the entire purpose behind the Enforcement Division, not to cut them down and bring them into cages, but to assimilate them and help them find their place. Because they were strangers in a strange land, after all. They had come over through a gate, most of them with no memories or recollections of where they'd come from. Aurthor was starting to get a headache. Don. Donovan shuffled at this. He became stiff. Donovan, he said flatly. What? Aurthor replied. Donovan looked at him straight in the eye, those eyes having nothing behind them that Donovan could convey, and nothing that Aurthor could receive as emotion or even anything other than the cold, glassy stare that was showing back at him. Donovan, please. Just Donovan. Aurthor felt like he was having to meet his partner for a second time, and this partner was not the man he remembered. Aurthor stammered. I apologize. Donovan, are you sure that you can work? I mean, don't you think that you should let the collective... Donovan pushed his hand up near Aurthor's face at this. No. That was the only response he was given. Aurthor wasn't sure if there was something more to it that Donovan wanted to say, perhaps something hiding behind his eyes, those glassy eyes. But he didn't say it. I'm fine. I'm different from you, and I'm sure you can tell. I can tell, too. Donovan trailed away for a moment, looking outside, seeing the pouring rain. This was a strange August, but then again this had been a strange couple of years. 2002, 6 years going by since the IO gate opened, and things definitely could not be called normal anymore, at least by mortal standards. You wouldn't be able to understand. That's the only thing that I can say. Donovan looked at him, again with the glassy look in his eyes, almost like someone, a druggy little freak sitting on the side of the street. Aurthor had seen this look before. It was one who was just so deep within himself he couldn't convey even simple thoughts. But Donovan seemed to surpass this. Frighteningly, he could convey these thoughts, but it seemed like they just sort of rolled out of him. Not like a person. Almost like a recording of a person, flat and toneless. There's no way that I can describe to you the way that this feels, Donovan said to him. There's no way. But I can tell you one thing. I am fully, physically capable of performing my job. I am obviously more than mentally capable. Those faculties are still within range. It's just a pattern, Aurthor. Aurthor cocked an eyebrow at this quizzically. A pattern? Donovan shook his head slowly to confirm his suspicions. A pattern, he replied. Patterns are the true deities of our reality. Even with the strange things occurring these days, patterns are the only things that we can trust, Aurthor. Aurthor took a deep drag of his cigarette, trying to understand what he was talking about, but failing. You're going to have to give me something more than that, Donovan. Donovan returned his view to Aurthor, no longer seeming to care about the rainfall. It didn't fit his patterns, Aurthor thought. Patterns are very important, Donovan replied to him. Patterns are the only thing that can take us to the correct answer. You might not understand it like I do, but I can assure you that that's the way it is. He said this last bit very matter-of-factly, and it made Aurthor wonder, what had he seen on the other side that gave him this absolute surety? He shook his head. He didn't have time to think about this. They had a job to do. The Hobbs. The Hobbs were the ones they were going after today. Hobbs, a popular slang term these days in New York City for hobgoblins. Boglekin is what they're usually called in a grand collective. Goblins, ogres. Things that you used to read about in storybooks and almost find comical, if not a little frightening. But they were definitely nothing to be laughed at these days. All of them, even their smallest cousins, were dangerous. The red cap, the ogre, the goblin, whatever you called them, whatever their culture had a name for them, they could be extremely dangerous. Donovan flipped open the field report and pointed at a photograph. It was a mutilated male corpse. The boy couldn't have been more than 13. They hadn't been able to identify him because he was so massively mauled and torn to pieces. This was definitely a paranormal kill. Either that or someone that knows very well how to imitate it. But most mortals don't go that far, especially not for something like a simple robbery. And it was more than likely a robbery. They had found nothing on the boy's corpse, except for a single metal sphere. The collective was still trying to determine the significance, if any, of this sphere, but that was beyond Aurthor and Donovan's investigation. Their investigation was to find this thing and either detain it or stomp it out. That's what the boys at the local precinct call it, stomping it out. Like a bug, his lieutenant had once told him. These things, I don't care what the politicians say, I don't care what the collective says. I've been working here since day one. You gotta kill them. That's the only thing that they understand. They understand when you rip their head off or shoot them in the middle of the head, if that even takes them down. Aurthor wasn't sure that he was inclined to agree with his lieutenant, but he was, in fact, his lieutenant, and that carried a certain amount of respect. So if his lieutenant told him that this was not a detain order and it was a kill order, then he had to follow protocol, even if he didn't particularly agree with it. Donovan pointed at the picture again. Male, he said. Most likely between the ages of 11 and 13. Prepubescent, if you will. Donovan slipped the photo out from the paperclip and showed it to Aurthor with a little bit more intensity. This one is the third victim, Donovan said. The third victim in a string of robberies that's been happening around the Brooklyn area that always end up in, well, look at this bloodbath. Donovan tapped on the photo, showing the heavy blood rings around the child, indicating that he was more than likely eviscerated before he died. It was awful. Aurthor had seen plenty in his time at the PED, but this one was particularly gruesome. He took a heavy drag on his cigarette, trying to steady himself. Okay, Aurthor said, heaving out smoke as he spoke. So, do we have anything further than the first two? Any piece of evidence at all? Donovan looked at the photo for a moment, and almost had a quizzical look on his face before returning it to the clip. No idea, he replied, folded the envelope that contained the file information, and then let out a very short and empty sigh. The only thing that I know is there has to be a pattern here, Donovan said, his voice quieting a little, almost as if it was meant to be an internal thought but just came out. The patterns are what matter. And once we figure out what these patterns are, we can figure out why it did this, and if there were any motivations beyond simple greed. But greed is usually a strong enough motivator to get these things to kill, especially the Bogles. You know, their love of the shiny and the metallic. The boy could have been carrying something as simple as a keychain, and little Redcap decided it was his now, and he would have it at any measure. Aurthor shook his head. I just can't believe that the motivation would be that strong for something so pointless, Donovan suggested. Arthur shook his head again. Not pointless, it's obviously not pointless to them. Donovan put both hands flat on the table and laughed a little, but it was cold and empty. Not true laughter. It almost felt like he was trying to mimic emotions to put Arthur at ease, but it actually did quite the opposite. Motivation. Motivation is unimportant. It's drive, it's urge. Arthur didn't like the tone of his voice, but lately he hasn't been liking the tone of Donovan's voice, for any reason. Well, Arthur sighed, taking another drag from the cigarette and thinking about today's next action. I guess we better get to work.